conducted over 40 years ago, and its implications for the development of students' literacy and disciplinary literacy in particular. One of the points I want to emphasize is that race is not equal to discourse. It's not the case that all of the white children across these white families in these different communities are using the same discourse. The same is true of the Black children in these different communities. The Black children in Maintown and the Black children in Tracton are developing different primary discourses in these different literacy ecologies and different literacy practices as well. So race and discourse aren't equivalent, just as race and culture are not equivalent. The Maintown literacy practices are also not better, even if they are dominant and more closely aligned with schools. That's not to say that the literacy practices in Maintown aren't valuable. Instead, it's to say that they're valuable based on what the community of discourse users value. So the question isn't, which approaches to literacy is the best one or which are better. The question instead is, how do the discourses support forms of participation in discourse communities? And then we could ask about all students. How do we want to equip all of them with tools to successfully navigate, move through, and affirm themselves in multiple discourse communities with multiple secondary discourses? And I think we have a good answer to that, even if it's hard work to do. But let me just try to further highlight this point. Practices in Maintown of supporting children to read texts imaginatively and write texts imaginatively is a valuable literacy practice in a community that values that kind of fictional play. Likewise, if we look at Rhodeville families and the literacy environments for children there, it actually is helpful to build students' vocabulary knowledge, to at times point them to the meanings of words and how they are used. And it's also helpful to develop literal interpretations of phenomena. In addition, it's helpful to get especially young readers and early readers and even pre-readers to focus on sounds, and in early literacy practices to make connections between letter patterns and sound patterns within words. In fact, that is an important basis of literacy development for all readers across all communities. In addition, in Rhodeville, if one of the values is writing thank you notes and grocery lists, those can be productive literacy activities. But thank you notes don't just have to be formulaic. They also could be creative spaces. Grocery lists don't have to be confined to one thing. They can be a space for young learners to practice invented spelling, which is an important developmental stage of writing development. So there's value in those emphases. Looking at Tracton and how children are apprenticed to the literacy practices in that community, the emphasis on wordplay, the use of metaphor, the community engagement around storytelling, those are forms of literary reasoning and literacy that are highly valued in secondary schooling, in high school, and in higher education, right? But they might not be as valued in elementary classes if the focus is on other pre-literacy skills, different pre-literacy skills. And these same forms of reasoning around the use of metaphor and storytelling show up in the ways that scientists draw on analogical forms of reasoning to interpret and explain phenomena. So it's not that these literacy practices aren't valuable. The question instead is, are we designing schools to recognize the value of a diversity of literacy practices and a diversity of secondary and primary discourses? And so a final point I would like to make about this study and its conclusions and what it implies for schools is that each of these discourse communities practice important literacy practices. And I can imagine drawing from each of these to build schools that leverage each of these literacy practices and the array of funds of knowledge that they give access to. So you can imagine designing schools so that all students from all discourse communities actually gain entry into and practice with each of these literacy practices. I guess one more point is the students in these studies did attend schools that were real. And just as is the case with many schools, those schools were designed with particular discourse communities in mind. And so whenever some discourse communities are privileged and others are marginalized, then you can expect really differential outcomes for different groups of students. And so part of the work of redesigning schools and reconsidering the teaching that we do across our disciplines is thinking more deeply about making space in the learning of our disciplines for multiple entry points for students belonging to different discourse communities, and then drawing out the forms of reasoning, the ways of using language and text that students have, but also making more explicit to them disciplinary literacies and believing that these students are fully capable of learning the literacies of our disciplines, provided that we provide the right kinds of supports for them to learn a new secondary discourse. I want to emphasize a few points